We have so many great mascots in video games, don't we? I mean, there's Mario for Nintendo, Sonic for Sega, Pac-Man for Namco, and Peter Molyneux for lying. But for every one of these 4 highly successful characters, there's at least 50 attempts at mascots that no one remembers at all anymore. Most of these came, released 1 or 2 rubbish games, and then were dropped as soon as anyone realised that no one was actually buying the blooming things. However, every now and then, a few of these mascots being scrapped had much stranger stories, with unusual beginnings and the odd weird, messed up, or even tragic finale. So, this episode is dedicated to those countermanded characters, those annulled avatars, and those eliminated emblems. As I say, but hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 mascots cancelled for incredibly messed up reasons. When a mascot is created, it's usually good for the company behind them to know a long-term plan of how far they're going to go with it. Is it going to be just for a couple of games? Or more? Maybe there could be more than that. You could end up like Earthworm Jim and get your own TV show. Not many video game characters did that. Well, not that made it past the pilot anyway. But one that could have had a chance was Captain Blasto, star of his very own 1998 imaginatively titled PlayStation game, Blasto.
Good luck, and remember, Uranus is on the line.
So what else is new?
The game itself had a tough time in development, with David Poe, the initial producer, unexpectedly passing away at the start of the project. The game also suffered considerable delays before being released in March of 1998, although the team said that by and large they had lots of fun making the game. The end result wasn't very acclaimed. Most people who reviewed it at the time said it was way too hard and frustrating for its own good. However, they also said that the game was worth playing purely for Captain Blasto alone, a classic, wisecracking and very funny superhero voiced by the star of The Simpsons, Saturday Night Live and news radio comedian Phil Hartman.
I'm so good.
Hartman had his own creative and personal input into the game, and was by all accounts a great person to work with.
Ouch, I'd say mankind is up crap creek without a spooge hammer, and now I've got to clean it up.
Sony even put a great deal into Blasto, positioning it as a potential new franchise with several new games, merchandise, and Phil Hartman at the centre of it. Despite the lukewarm reception given to the first game, there was already plans for the sequel. However, on May 28, 1998, those plans will be stopped in their tracks. Following a heated argument, Phil's wife, Bryn Omdahl, shot and killed him as he slept in his bed, before shooting herself in a murder-suicide. Blasto was one of the final projects that Phil Hartman would complete in his lifetime, with the game released only 2 months before his tragic death. Designer Jay Beard called Phil Hartman the life and soul of Blasto, so without Hartman at the helm, nobody saw any point in continuing, so the sequel was quietly cancelled. A very shocking and tragic end to the chances of a mascot that could have well gone into much greater things. Microsoft are pretty famous for their approach to games. It's all about big shooters, tons of guns, gravelly voices, and lots of blasting. And because of this, they're never going to be successful in Japan, right? Right, but there was a time, however, when they tried to change all of that back in 2002, with a mascot that most people have tried to wipe from their memory. Meet Blinx. He's a time-sweeping cat, and it was all set to be the Xbox's answer to Sonic and Mario. He even had a pedigree. His first game, Blinx the Time Sweeper, was directed by ex-Sega employee Naoto Oshima, the man who had originally designed Sonic the Hedgehog. However, this is a bloke who wanted Sonic to be named Mr. Needlemouse originally, so let that sink in for a moment. Now, if you asked most people who the Xbox's mascot is, they'd probably answer Master Chief. But surprisingly, Microsoft never actually wanted him as their mascot. Not only were his games seen as too violent, but he didn't exactly have much of an identity. What with his face totally covered by his visor and having the personality of a cinder block and all. It was thought that Blinx would be the face of Billy Gates' plastic behemoth, and his first game actually didn't get too bad a reception. But that wasn't to last. After a few months or so, it turned out that everyone actually hated Blinx the cat. And after his second game, Blinx 2 Masters of Time and Space got a thoroughly average critical and commercial reception, the final straw that had Microsoft put this kitty to sleep was because he started appearing on internet top 10 worst characters lists. Yeah, alright, irony duly noted. But Microsoft had to make the decision: keep going with Blinx or embrace their destiny with Master Chief. They obviously chose the latter, abandoning thoughts of a child-friendly game starring streetwise chronological janitorial felines with attitude forever and throwing themselves into Master Chief's mechanised arms. In fact, they dropped Blinx so hard that come 2015, no one at Microsoft even bothered to renew the trademark they had on the character. So what are you waiting for, coders and creatively anemic Kickstarter campaigns? Blinx is out there, waiting for you to take him to the stardom he deserved. And you won't get sued for it either. Well, probably. If you ever had a ZX Spectrum, then without a doubt you would have come across Horace at some point. This horrific blue amorphous blob with chest cavities for eyes could be just about anything you wanted. He could be Pac-Man in Hungry Horace, Frogger in Horace Goes Skiing, and even Pitfall Harry in Horace and the Spiders. He was big, blue, and couldn't care less about copyright infringement. Now you might be thinking, hang on, all these games were successful. And indeed they were. Possibly as there was bugger all else to play at the time. But Horace's games were amongst the best-selling titles of the Specky's first couple of years. And even if his hideous appearance gave children nightmares, it was something of a mascot for the system. Better than those dodgy keys anyway. So why then, after 3 games, did Horace suddenly disappear? Well, there were plans for the developer Melbourne House to release a 4th Horace game, titled Horace to the Rescue, in 1985. But unfortunately, these were cancelled when the game's creator, William Tang, suffered a collapsed lung, and then mysteriously disappeared. Now, not much is known about Horace to the Rescue, including what arcade game the Blue Blob was going to rip off next. Although several people have made games to try and predict that direction that Horace was going to go in. However, short of a cameo in an Inspector Gadget game from 1987, and Horace's publisher Scion attempting to make him a mascot for their short-lived palm-top computer, the Scion 3, Horace never graced the shelves ever again, thanks to William Tang's affliction. And despite the best efforts of Horace fans everywhere, no one knows anything about what happened to his Australian creator. He left the industry in 1985, and over 3 decades later, he has never been heard of since. Horace Goes Unsolved Mysteries. Most Olympic mascots are equally as bizarre as they are unmemorable. I mean, look at our London Olympics. We had an eyeball in a gimp suit. I mean, what the hell was all that about? However, you might get lucky and have them based on an animal indigenous to the host's country, but 90% of the time, they're generic nonsense thought up by some pretentious twat on a marketing team designed to offend as few people as possible. But there's one exception to that. Izzy, the mascot for the Atlanta 1996 Olympic Games. Now, Izzy was, on the whole, pushed a lot more than other Olympic mascots, and he wasn't based on an animal either. Wikipedia lists him as an abstract figure, which is a good euphemism for we haven't got a bloody clue what this thing's supposed to be. And Izzy's hype train would begin early, as early as 1992 in fact, when he made an appearance at the closing ceremony of the Barcelona 1992 games, and did little more except stagger around the stage while everyone dancing around him desperately tried to ignore it. Basically, think of the gobbledygooker, but in front of hundreds of millions of people across the planet, all wondering whether this was actually supposed to represent the city of Atlanta to the world. Now, you might be asking, why are you talking about an Olympic mascot and a list of video game characters, Larry? Well, the character was pushed so hard that Izzy ended up starring in a cartoon series. And not just one, but 2 video games. Izzy's quest for the Olympic rings, based on the TV series, and Izzy's adventure on the PC. No Olympic mascot before, or even since, has ever had that honour bestowed upon them, even if the games themselves are fairly nondescript US gold licensed fluff. It's quite clear that the designers of Izzy had high hopes for the character, that maybe he'd even have a future beyond the Olympics. But alas, this was not to happen. Izzy was reviled from the beginning, when he was literally called What Is It as early as 1992. People decided that What Is It was either a blue doofus, roadkill, or a big sperm with legs. Izzy's abstract shape was designed so he could morph into anything he wanted. But once he'd been branded as a pile of spunk, his fate was basically sealed. Izzy would go on to be heavily redesigned. His name was changed, he was made smaller, more childlike, and less, well, semen-like. But the damage was done. So with all that said and done, why does he belong here? All Olympic mascots get dropped for the same reason: their games end. However, Izzy is perhaps the only mascot to have the honour of being virtually dropped before his own Olympic Games. After all the hype of the 4 years of mockery, Izzy didn't even appear at the opening ceremony of 1996. Children liked him and bought his dolls, but that was about it. He barely appeared at the games, and would quickly be regarded as the single worst Olympic mascot ever by the people who judge these things. So, not a bad showing on the whole. And of course, we'll end this episode with the most screwed up reason of all. Now, sometimes mascots aren't meant to be cute. They have other purposes. Domino's Pizza's mascot, the Noid, is one of them. I mean, his name is literally a play on the word annoyed, and his job was to stop the brave Domino's Pizza delivery staff from delivering their payloads to hungry Americans in 30 minutes or less, thus coining the catchy slogan, "Avoid the Noid." He was designed to be an obnoxious troll. In fact, one wonders if Capcom really understood the point of the character when they made an NES game about him and released it as Yo Noid, a game where you, as the Noid, help save a city from an evil doppelganger and end up with a pizza reward for your trouble. I mean, this despite the fact that the Noid hates pizza and wants people to stop eating them. The Noid, in any case, was a hugely successful campaign for Domino's. Whether or not the game was successful in capturing the spirit of the ads, it still sold loads, as did anything with a Noid on it. Kids absolutely loved him, and he became a pop culture figure. But you can't just measure things purely on success. There were 2 reasons why the hugely successful Noid was canned. First off, that 30 minutes or less policy was stopped by a bunch of real-life Noids called the National Safe Workplace Institute, who protested this policy meant drivers had to speed to their delivery points, thus creating unsafe working conditions. According to them, 20 Domino's drivers had died on the job in the year 1988 alone. But the complaints stuck, as did the lawsuit related to one of these accidents, and Domino's eventually dropped the policy, leaving the Noid out of a job. Now, sure, Domino's could have adapted the Noid story and continued on with the promotion. After all, this was during the height of his popularity. However, things were about to make a much darker turn for the bunny-eared, jumpsuited Italian rarebit despiser. On January 20th, 1989, a paranoid schizophrenic by the name of Kenneth Lamar Noid went into a Domino's in Atlanta, of all places, and held 2 employees armed hostage for 5 hours, demanding $100,000, a car, and a novel about the Freemasons. Ultimately, the employees escaped and Kenneth was arrested, although not before firing his gun into the ceiling. So, why did he do this? Because, in Kenneth's mind, the Noid adverts were specifically making fun of him personally. And on top of this, he also had an ongoing feud in his head with the owner of Domino's Pizza, Tom Monahan. This standoff was his way of getting back at Tom, believing that Monahan would go through his apartment when he wasn't at home. Mind you, apparently he did order and eat a pizza during the standoff, so such blood feuds are clearly meaningless when compared with a piping hot slab of bread and mozzarella that was undoubtedly delivered in much less than 30 minutes. However, in the world of tabloid journalism, this story was a home run. The national papers were filled with headlines and stories detailing how Domino's couldn't avoid the Noid this time. So, in the face of this PR nightmare, Domino's had no choice but to drop the mascot completely, and he has barely been seen ever since. The charges against Kenneth Lamar Noid were ultimately dropped for reasons of insanity. However, Kenneth was never able to shake off the belief that Domino's were targeting him personally. In February of 1995, aged just 27, Kenneth committed suicide in his apartment. This all goes to show, I suppose, that no one should ever underestimate the power of advertising.